You know, I was sitting in my garden just last week watching a butterfly struggling to emerge from its cocoon. My first instinct, and I bet this would be yours too, was to help it. To tear open that cocoon and free that beautiful creature. Sounds like the kind thing to do, doesn't it? But here's what most people don't know. That struggle, that difficult process of breaking free is exactly what strengthens the butterfly's wings. If you help it by breaking open the cocoon, the butterfly will never fly. And right there, my friends, is everything that's wrong with how we've been taught to think about happiness. We've been sold this beautiful lie that happiness should come easily, that if something feels hard or uncomfortable, we must be doing it wrong. That if we just get that promotion, buy that house, find that perfect relationship, well, I'm here to tell you something that might shake you to your core. Everything. And I mean everything you've been taught about happiness is wrong. How many of you woke up this morning thinking, when I finally get blank, then I'll be happy? Come on, be honest with yourselves. Raise your hands. Look around. Look at all these hands. We're all playing the same game, aren't we? The I'll be happy when game. I'll be happy when I lose 20 pounds. I'll be happy when I get that dream job. I'll be happy when my kids get into the right college. How many of you have already achieved something you once thought would make you happy forever? Maybe it's a goal you set years ago. A certain income level, a dream house, a relationship. And how long did that happiness last? You see, we've been approaching happiness like it's some kind of destination. Like it's a place we'll finally arrive at once we check enough boxes on our life's to-do list. And that, my friends, is the first massive lie we've been taught about happiness. They sure doesn't work that way. Has anyone ever seen a tree that stops growing because it's arrived? Does the ocean ever say, well, I've made enough waves today, I think I'll just stay still forever now? Of course not. Yet somehow we've convinced ourselves that happiness is this fixed point we need to. Let me share something personal with you. Back in 1974, I was teaching at St. John's University in New York. From the outside, I had everything that was supposed to make me happy. Good job, respect of my colleagues, financial security, but I felt this gnawing emptiness inside. And one day, while reading the Tao Te Ching, I came across this line that changed everything. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. It hit me like a lightning bolt. We've been trying to define happiness in the same way we define success, through external metrics and achievements. But true happiness, like the Tao, cannot be contained in a definition or achieved through a checklist. It's not a destination. It's a way of traveling. It's not a place you arrive at. It's how you choose to walk the path. And most importantly, it's not something you chase. It's something you create, moment by moment, choice by choice. Think about a child playing with bubbles. Have you ever watched a child chase bubbles? What happens? The faster they run after them, the more the bubbles float away. But when they stand still and let the bubbles come to them, that's when the magic happens. That's when they can actually catch them. If only for a moment. We've been chasing happiness like those bubbles, haven't we? Running faster and faster, wondering why it always seems just out of reach. And in our chase, we've bought into 3 devastating myths about happiness that I'm going to shatter for you today. The first myth is that happiness is a result of our circumstances. How many times have you thought, I'd be happier if only my situation were different? This is what I call the circumstantial happiness trap. And it's probably the most dangerous belief we can hold. Let me tell you about Sarah, a woman I met during a seminar in 1985. Sarah had everything society tells us we need to be happy. Successful career, loving family, beautiful home. Yet she felt empty inside. Meanwhile, in the same seminar, there was James, a man who lost his job and was going through a divorce. But James had this incredible light in his eyes, this unmistakable joy that seemed to radiate from within. What was the difference? James had discovered something that Sarah hadn't yet realized. Happiness isn't about what's happening to you. It's about how you're responding to what's happening. This brings me to one of the most profound truths I've discovered in my journey, Your happiness is not determined by what life brings to your doorstep. It's determined by the thoughts you choose to think about what life brings to your doorstep. Let that sink in for a moment. We've been taught that our thoughts are mere reactions to our circumstances. But what if I told you it's the other way around? What if your thoughts are actually creating your experience of reality? What if, and this is revolutionary, your thoughts are the paintbrush and your life is the canvas? I remember sitting with a group of inmates at a maximum security prison in 1982. One man, let's call him Michael, told me something I'll never forget. He said, "Dr. Dyer, I may be locked up in here, but I've never felt more free in my life." He had discovered that true freedom and true happiness comes from within. You see, we've been taught that happiness is something that happens to us. But the truth is, happiness is something that happens through us. It's not about what we have or don't have. It's about who we're being in each moment. Think about water for a moment. Water doesn't struggle to flow. It simply finds its path. It doesn't fight against the rocks in its way. It flows around them. It doesn't complain about the terrain. It adapts to it. And in that adaptation, in that natural flow, it creates something beautiful. That's what real happiness is like. It's not about removing all the rocks from your path. It's about learning to flow like water, to move with grace through whatever life presents to you. Now, I want you to do something with me. Close your eyes for a moment. Think about the last time you felt truly, deeply happy, not excited, not pleased, but genuinely, peacefully happy. Hold that moment in your mind. What were you chasing in that moment? What were you trying to achieve? What were you worried about? Open your eyes. I'm willing to bet that in that moment of true happiness, you weren't chasing anything. You weren't trying to get anywhere. You were simply being present, fully engaged in that moment of your life. This is the first great truth about happiness that contradicts everything we've been taught. Happiness isn't something you chase. It's something you allow. It's not something you achieve. It's something you uncover. It's not something you get. It's something you are. You know what amazes me most when I speak to people about happiness? It's not their struggles that surprise me. It's how many of them are struggling with exactly the same thing. They're living in their minds instead of their hearts. Let me explain what I mean by sharing something that happened to me in 1979. I was giving a lecture at a university, and afterward, a young professor came up to me. She was brilliant, multiple degrees, groundbreaking research, but there were tears in her eyes when she said, "Wayne, I've spent my entire life becoming smarter, but I don't feel any happier." And that's the second great lie we've been taught about happiness, that it comes from what we know rather than how we live. We've created a world where intelligence is measured by degrees, success by dollars, and happiness by Instagram likes. We've turned our minds into storage units for information instead of tools for transformation. And in doing so, we've missed something essential about the nature of happiness. Here's a question for you. Have you ever noticed how young children don't need to learn how to be happy? They just are. They haven't yet been taught that happiness needs to be earned, achieved, or won. They haven't yet learned to doubt their right to joy. But somewhere along the way, someone told us that happiness had to be deserved, that it had to be worked for, that it had to be logical. And that's when we started living in our heads instead of our hearts. I remember a conversation I had with a monk in India in the early 1980s. He said something that shook me to my core. The mind is a wonderful servant, but a terrible master. Think about that for a moment. We've allowed our minds to become our masters, questioning every moment of joy, analyzing every burst of happiness, wondering if we deserve it. The third great lie we've been taught about happiness is that it needs to make sense, that it needs to be rational, that it needs to fit into some logical framework that we can explain to others. But true happiness often defies logic. Have you ever tried to explain why you love someone? Or why a certain piece of music moves you to tears? Or why watching a sunset fills you with peace? You can't, because the deepest truths of our existence don't fit into logical boxes. Let me share another story with you. In 1977, I met a woman named Eleanor at one of my seminars. Eleanor had survived the Holocaust, lost her entire family, and endured things that none of us can imagine. Yet she had this remarkable ability to find joy in the smallest things: a bird song, a child's laugh, the smell of rain. When I asked her how she maintained such joy after experiencing such horror, she said something I'll never forget. I decided that by being unhappy, I was giving power to those who hurt me. My joy became my resistance. Happiness understood something profound that most of us miss. Happiness isn't a response to what happens to us. It's a decision we make about how we're going to be in the world. Think about that, and really think about it. How many of us are waiting for the world to give us permission to be happy? Waiting for circumstances to be perfect? Waiting for all our problems to be solved? Here's another truth that contradicts everything we've been taught. Problems don't prevent happiness. They're opportunities to deepen it. Just like that butterfly struggling to emerge from its cocoon, our challenges aren't obstacles to our happiness. They're invitations to grow stronger. I've spoken to thousands of people over the years, and I've noticed something fascinating. The happiest people aren't the ones with the least problems. They're the ones with the most helpful perspective on their problems. Let me give you an example. In 1983, I met two men who'd both lost their jobs in the same company layoff. The first man was devastated, seeing it as the end of his world. The second man was excited, seeing it as the beginning of a new adventure. Same circumstance, completely different experience. A difference, not their situation. This brings us to another crucial truth about happiness that nobody taught us. Happiness isn't about having what you want. It's about wanting what you have. It's not about getting somewhere else. It's about being more fully where you are. But here's where it gets really interesting. We've been taught that happiness is something we need to pursue, achieve, or maintain. But what if happiness isn't something we do at all? What if it's something we stop doing? When do you feel most peaceful, most content, most genuinely happy? Isn't it when you stop trying to be happy? When you stop worrying about whether you're happy enough? When you stop comparing your happiness to someone else's? I worked with a success coach in 1975 who was absolutely miserable despite having everything society told him he needed to be happy. One day, out of frustration, he stopped trying to figure out how to be happy and just went for a walk. And then, without trying, without forcing, without analyzing, he found himself feeling peaceful for the first time in years. This is what I call the great paradox of happiness. The more we chase it, the more it eludes us. The more we try to grab it, the more it slips through our fingers. But when we stop chasing, when we stop trying so hard, when we simply allow ourselves to be, that's when happiness finds us. You see, we've been taught that happiness is like a butterfly that we need to chase and catch. But the truth is, happiness is more like the air we breathe. It's always there. We just need to stop blocking it out. Have you ever watched a child play? They don't play to be happy. They play because they're playing. They don't laugh to feel joy. They laugh because they're laughing. They don't dance to achieve something. They dance because they're dancing. They're completely present in the moment, fully engaged in what they're doing. And that's another truth about happiness that contradicts everything we've been taught. Happiness isn't a goal to achieve. It's a way of being. It's not something we get. It's something we allow. It's not something we find. It's something we uncover by removing all the barriers we put in its way. Let me tell you about something that happened in my garden back in 1984. I had spent months trying to grow the perfect roses. I read every book, followed every expert's advice, used all the right fertilizers. And you know what? Those roses refused to bloom. Then that winter, I got sick and couldn't tend to the garden at all. When spring came, those same roses bloomed more beautifully than I could have imagined. Life has a funny way of teaching us its deepest truths, doesn't it? Those roses taught me something profound about happiness. Sometimes our endless striving, our constant effort to make things perfect, actually prevents the very thing we're trying to create. That brings us to the fourth great lie we've been taught about happiness, that it requires constant effort and control. We've been taught that happiness is like a delicate plant that needs constant tending, when in reality it's more like a wild flower that knows exactly how to bloom on its own. When was the last time you tried to control your way into feeling happy? How did that work out for you? You see, we've been taught to approach happiness like an engineering problem. If we just get all the variables right, if we just follow the correct formula, if we just maintain perfect control, then we'll achieve happiness. But happiness isn't something to be engineered. It's something to be allowed. I remember working with a CEO in 1982. He ran his life like he ran his company with spreadsheets, action items, and quarterly goals. He even had a happiness optimization strategy. He came to me exhausted, burning out, and more miserable than ever. His pursuit of happiness had become another source of stress. Here's what I told him, and what I want to tell you. You don't need to pursue happiness any more than you need to pursue your shadow. Your shadow is always with you. You just need to step into the light. This brings us to one of the most revolutionary truths about happiness. It's not about adding something to your life. It's about removing the barriers you've built against it. It's not about becoming something new. It's about unbecoming everything that isn't really you. Think about a glass of muddy water. How do you make it clear? You don't add anything. You just let it be still, and the mud naturally settles to the bottom. Our minds are like that muddy water. We don't need to add more thoughts, more strategies, more control. We just need to let our mental mud settle. But here's where it gets really interesting. We've been taught that happiness comes from getting what we want. But I've observed something fascinating over my years of working with people. Getting what you want doesn't guarantee happiness, but being happy often helps you get what you want. Let me share something that happened at a seminar I gave in 1980. A woman named Margaret stood up and shared her story. She had spent years trying to find the perfect relationship, reading every self-help book, going to every workshop. Nothing worked. Then one day she decided to stop trying to find happiness through a relationship and instead focus on being happy on her own. Within months, she met her future husband, not because she was looking, but because she was finally being herself. This points to another truth that contradicts everything we've been taught. Happiness isn't something you find in the future. It's something you bring to the present. Most of us treat happiness like it's some kind of reward that life will give us once we've checked all the right boxes. If I just work hard enough, if I just achieve enough, if I just become good enough, then I'll be happy. But that's like saying, I'll start being alive once I've accomplished everything on my to-do list. What if you decided to be happy first? What if, instead of treating happiness as a reward for achievement, you treated it as fuel for achievement? What if happiness isn't the destination but the vehicle? I worked with an Olympic athlete in 1978 who transformed her performance when she stopped seeing happiness as something she'd get after winning a medal and started seeing it as the energy that would help her win the medal. Her entire training changed, not because she was working harder, but because she was bringing joy to her work. This brings us to another crucial truth about happiness that nobody taught us. Happiness isn't just a feeling, it's a force. It's not just an emotion that happens to us. It's an energy we bring to everything we do. Think about someone you know who's genuinely happy. Don't they seem to have a certain energy about them? Haven't you noticed how things seem to flow more easily around them? That's not a coincidence. When you're genuinely happy, not the forced, fake it till you make it kind of happy, but the deep, authentic kind, you operate at a different frequency. Your brain works better, your body, your relationships work better. Even your luck seems to get better. But here's the key, and this is something that took me years to understand. This kind of happiness isn't dependent on external circumstances. It's not about having everything perfect in your life. It's about bringing your own light to whatever circumstances you find. I remember visiting a hospice in 1981 and meeting a patient named David. He was in his final days, yet he had this remarkable peace about him. When I asked him his secret, he said, I finally realized that I don't have to be healthy to be happy. I don't have to be successful to be happy. I don't even have to be alive much longer to be happy. I just have to be willing to be happy right now, exactly as I am. That's wisdom. You can't find it in any book. That's truth. You can't learn in any school. That's the kind of understanding that comes only when you stop trying to figure happiness out and start letting it figure you out. You see, we've been taught that happiness is like a distant star that we need to reach. But the truth is, happiness is more like the sun. It's always shining. Sometimes clouds get in the way, but that doesn't mean the sun has stopped shining. It just means we've temporarily lost sight of it. You know what's fascinating about the human mind? We tend to treat happiness like a math problem, as if adding enough positive things and subtracting enough negative things will somehow equal happiness. But life doesn't work that way, does it? I'll never forget this remarkable woman I met in 1977 in Detroit. She lived in what most would consider poverty, yet her home was filled with more joy than many mansions I'd visited. When I asked her about this, she said something profound. Amy, most people spend their lives gathering possessions. I've spent my life gathering moments. That brings us to the fifth great lie we've been taught about happiness, that it's a product of accumulation. More money, more success, more achievements, more relationships, more experiences, as if happiness were something we could stock up on like canned goods for a winter storm. But here's what nobody tells you. The universe doesn't operate on addition and subtraction. It operates on multiplication and division. When you share joy, it multiplies. When you divide love, it grows. When you try to keep happiness all to yourself, it shrinks. I remember teaching at a university in 1975 when a student challenged me on this idea. He said, "Dr. Dyer, that sounds nice, but it's not practical. The world doesn't work that way." So I asked him to try an experiment. For 1 week, he would focus on accumulating as much happiness as he could for himself. The next week, he would focus on creating happiness for others. You know what he discovered? The week he spent trying to gather happiness for himself left him feeling empty and anxious. The week he spent creating happiness for others filled him with more joy than he'd ever experienced. Why? Because happiness isn't something you gather, it's something you generate. This leads us to another truth that turns everything we've been taught on its head. The fastest way to find happiness isn't to chase it for yourself. It's to create it for others. Think about the last time you made someone else genuinely happy. Remember how that felt? That warming of your heart? That lightness in your spirit? That wasn't just a nice side effect. That was real happiness. The kind that doesn't need to be chased because it grows naturally from within. But here's where most people get stuck. They say, "Wayne, that's all well and good when things are going well. But what about when life gets hard? What about when things fall apart?" Let me tell you about something that happened to me in 1983. I lost a significant amount of money in an investment gone wrong. On paper, it was devastating. But in that moment of loss, I made a discovery that changed my life. I realized that while I had lost my money, I hadn't lost my ability to choose how to respond to that loss. This brings us to another revolutionary truth about happiness. It's not about having the power to control what happens to you. It's about having the power to control how you respond to what happens to you. Most of us have been taught that our happiness depends on our circumstances. But what if I told you that your circumstances depend on your happiness? What if the way you choose to be in the world actually shapes the world you experience? I worked with a man in 1979 who had lost everything in a fire, his home, his possessions, even his family photos. But instead of falling into despair, he made a remarkable choice. He said, "If I can't have my old life back, I'm going to create a new life that's even better." And he did. Not because circumstances favored him, but because he refused to let circumstances dictate his inner state. It's not a truth that nobody teaches us about happiness. It's not a reaction to life. It's a way of creating life. When you're genuinely happy, you don't just experience the world differently. You create a different world to experience. This isn't positive thinking or wishful dreaming. This is about understanding a fundamental truth about human consciousness. Your outer world will always organize itself to match your inner world. I remember counseling a couple in 1976 who were constantly fighting about money. They thought more money would solve their problems and make them happy. But when they finally got a financial windfall, nothing changed. Why? Because they hadn't changed their inner state. They were still operating from a place of fear and scarcity. It's not about having what you want. It's about wanting what you have while working toward what you want. Most people live in a state of perpetual postponement, always waiting for the next thing before they allow themselves to be happy. I'll be happy when I get the promotion. I'll be happy when I lose the weight. I'll be happy when I find the right person. But here's what I've observed over decades of working with people. Those who wait for happiness never find it, while those who choose happiness often find everything else. Think about it like this. When you're happy, your brain works better. You see more opportunities. You have more energy. You're more resilient. You're more creative. You're more magnetic to other people. In other words, happiness isn't just the reward for success. It's often the cause of success. This brings us to one of the most powerful truths about happiness. It's not just an emotional state. It's a creative force. When you're genuinely happy, you're not just feeling different. You're operating differently. You're creating differently. You're living differently. I remember meeting a painter in 1984 who was struggling with artist block. She was waiting for inspiration to make her happy enough to paint. I suggested she try it the other way around, to paint herself into happiness. When she started approaching her canvas with joy instead of waiting for joy to approach her, her entire artistic practice transformed. You see, we've been taught that happiness is something that happens to us. But the truth is, happiness is something that happens through us. It's not a passive experience. It's an act of creation. Now we come to what might be the most important part of our journey together. Everything we've discussed so far leads us to this fundamental truths. Happiness isn't something you find. It's something you become. Let me share something deeply personal with you. In 1972, I was at what looked like the peak of my career. I had had everything society told me would make me happy, but I felt empty inside. One morning, I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back at me. Not because I'd changed physically, but because I'd been living someone else's version of happiness. This brings us to the sixth and perhaps most damaging lie we've been taught about happiness, that it looks the same for everyone, that there's some universal formula, some one-size-fits-all approach to being happy. Think about that for a moment. Would you expect everyone to have the same favorite food, the same favorite color, the same dreams? Of course not. So why have we accepted this bizarre idea that happiness should look the same for everyone? I worked with an investment banker in 1980 who was miserable despite his seven-figure income. Everyone told him he should be happy. After all, he had made it. But his soul was crying out for something different. He loved working with wood, creating beautiful furniture with his hands. When he finally gave himself permission to pursue his own version of happiness, his entire life transformed. This points to another profound truth about happiness. Your happiness doesn't need to make sense to anyone else. It just needs to be authentic to you. Most of us spend so much time trying to fit our happiness into other people's boxes that we forget to ask ourselves what actually brings us joy. We're so busy trying to be happy in ways that look good on paper that we miss the simple, authentic moments of joy that are uniquely ours. I remember meeting a woman in 1974 who found her deepest happiness sitting alone in her garden at dawn, watching the world wake up. Her family thought she was strange. Her friends didn't understand. But she had discovered something precious, her own authentic source of joy. This brings us to what I consider the master key to happiness: authenticity. Not the carefully curated authenticity we see on social media, but real, raw, sometimes messy authenticity. You see, happiness isn't about becoming some idealized version of yourself. It's about becoming more fully who you already are. It's not about adding something to yourself. It's about removing everything that isn't really you. Think about water for a moment. Water doesn't try to be anything other than what it is. It doesn't compare itself to other elements. It doesn't wish it could be fire or earth. It simply is what it is. And in that complete acceptance of its nature, it becomes incredibly powerful. The same is true for us. The moment you stop trying to be happy like someone else and start being happy in your own unique way, something magical happens, the struggle ends, the resistance dissolves, the joy begins to flow naturally. But here's where most people get stuck. They say, Wayne, I don't know what makes me happy anymore. I've spent so long trying to be happy in the right way that I've lost touch with what brings me joy. If that's you, I want you to try something right now. Close your eyes and think back to when you were a child. What made you lose track of time? What made you lose track of time? What made you forget to eat? What made you feel fully alive? In those memories, you'll find clues to your authentic happiness, because children, before they're taught how they should be happy, naturally gravitate toward what truly brings them joy. Now, I'm not suggesting you need to go back to playing with toy trucks or skipping rope, but in those early inclinations toward creating or exploring or helping others or solving puzzles, you'll find the seeds of what still brings you genuine joy. This brings us to our final truth about happiness, and is perhaps the most important one. Happiness isn't a destination you reach. It's a muscle you develop. Just like building physical strength requires regular exercise, building happiness requires regular practice. Not the practice of pretending to be happy, but the practice of choosing to align with your authentic joy again and again, moment by moment. I've seen this truth play out countless times. In 1985, I worked with a group of people who committed to practicing authentic happiness for 30 days. Not forced positivity, not fake smiles, but genuine alignment with their own unique source of joy. The transformations were remarkable, not because their circumstances changed dramatically, but because they developed their happiness muscle. So here's what I want you to take away from our time together today. Everything you've been taught about happiness being something you achieve, acquire, or arrive at is wrong. Happiness isn't out there waiting for you to find it. It's in here waiting for you to choose it every moment of every day. You have a choice. You can choose to keep chasing happiness in all the places it isn't, or you can choose to recognize that happiness is your natural state. Not something you get, but something you are. You can choose to keep trying to be happy like everyone else, or you can choose to discover and embrace your own unique expression of joy. You can choose to wait for the perfect circumstances before you allow yourself to be happy. Or you can choose to be happy right now exactly as you are, where you are. Remember the butterfly we talked about at the beginning? The one struggling to emerge from its cocoon? You are that butterfly. Your struggles aren't preventing your happiness. They're strengthening you for flight. And just like that butterfly, you don't need to be taught how to fly. You don't need to be taught how to be happy. You just need to stop believing all the things that tell you can't. It's not something you learn. It's something you remember. It's not something you achieve. It's something you uncover. It's not something you become. It's something you already are. So let today be the day you stop chasing happiness and start choosing it. Let today be the day you stop trying to be happy like everyone else and start being happy like yourself. Let today be the day you remember who you really are. Because in that remembering, in that returning to your authentic self, you'll discover what I believe is life's greatest secret. Happiness isn't just a feeling. It's who you are at your core. And nothing, absolutely nothing, can take that away.